Hello and welcome back to A New Era. I'm Olivia Baxendale, a knowledge lawyer in Bird & Bird's employment team, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Alison Dixon, a partner in our international employment team, and Rob Collier-Wright, a legal director in the team. In today's podcast, we're focusing on guaranteed hours, and I think we can all agree that the provisions in the Act around guaranteed hours are lengthy and complex, so we will try to break this down for our listeners today as much as possible. So let's dive in. There's a lot to discuss. Alison, if I can bring you in here, let's start with the fundamental question. What problem is the legislation trying to solve? And in plain terms, what does a guaranteed hours offer actually mean?
Hi, Olivia, and thank you. So, today in the UK, a worker on a 0 hours contract could be working 40 hours a week for the same employer for years and still have no contractual guarantee of how many hours they will get the next day, let alone the next month. Workers may only be told in the morning that there's work for them to do that afternoon, or turn up for a shift only to be told that there is no work for them and therefore no pay. So, against that backdrop, the government has three main objectives for this legislation. First of all, establishing a baseline of security and stability for workers facing unpredictable hours so that they can plan their lives more effectively. Secondly, they want to rebalance labour market flexibility. And thirdly, they want to support sustained economic growth across the UK. So, importantly, the government is not banning 0 hours contracts altogether. They recognise that some workers genuinely value the flexibility, students and carers being obvious examples. What the Act is doing instead is creating the baseline of security and predictability, ending so called one sided flexibility, or at least that's what the government is trying to achieve. And how does it do that? Well, it does it by introducing this concept of a guaranteed hours offer. Essentially, that is an offer to a worker to enter into a new or varied contract. If the worker accepts, that contract needs to set out the number of hours the worker would need to work and the employer would need to provide. And those workers, crucially, must reflect the hours that the worker actually worked during a specified reference period. Importantly, the worker can still decline a guaranteed hours offer and remain on their existing contract or arrangement if they prefer. So workers do still retain a choice.
Thanks, Alison. And Rob, turning to you, could you maybe talk us through who is within the scope of these changes? Because my sense is that the changes reach further than some employers may actually currently appreciate.
Thanks, Olivia. So, to be in scope, a worker must either work under a 0 hours contract or have a contract that guarantees a number of hours that equals or falls below a particular hours threshold, which will be specified in the regulation. There are also several other conditions that the worker must meet, but the key point for many employers is that it's not just 0 hours contract that are caught. The low hours threshold is one of the most consequential decisions that the government still has to make. Options under consultation range from 8 to 48 hours per week, although the government's preference is for the threshold to be set within the range of 8 to 20 hours per week. That said, the range on the table is extraordinarily wide, and depending on where it lands, the number of employers affected could look very different. What is striking is that even at the lower end of the government's preferred range, people working a fairly modest number of hours would be captured. Think, for example, weekend retail staff or casual bar workers. Fixed-term workers are also caught. A guaranteed hours offer that varies existing terms and conditions must make an existing fixed-term contract permanent, save where it's reasonable for it to remain a fixed-term contract. A guaranteed offer that takes the form of a contract cannot be for a fixed term unless it's reasonable, for instance, where the worker is only needed for a specific task or until the occurrence of a particular event. There is also an important anti-avoidance provision intended to prevent employers from using a series of short-term contracts to avoid the right to offer guaranteed hours. So simply cycling workers through successive short-term arrangements will not be an option for employers.
And what about companies in sectors that rely heavily on seasonal or casual staffing and genuinely need that flexibility to meet fluctuations in demand? Is there any protection there, Alison?
As Rob mentioned, fixed term and seasonal staffing models are not entirely outside the new regime. There seems to be a potential route through. So, if a contract genuinely expires before the reference period ends, the duty doesn't bite, as long as it was actually reasonable to use a fixed term arrangement. And the problem for employers who routinely re engage seasonal workers is that the legislation flips the burden of proof. against them. So if the same workers come back on successive short-term contracts doing essentially the same job, the employer will have to justify why the need was ever genuinely temporary. And that will be a harder argument to make than many currently appreciate. And that's because in that scenario, it will be presumed that it was not reasonable for the individual to be on a limited term contract unless the employer can show otherwise. So that reversal of the burden of proof is quite significant. The government is actively seeking views on these issues in the consultation and asks for examples of temporary need that would need to be addressed in regulations, such as a seasonal demand for workers. And that aspect of the consultation will obviously materially impact employers in particular sectors, such as agriculture, hospitality, and retail.
Yes, so how the government addresses that aspect is going to be crucial for many sectors with that seasonal or fluctuating customer demand. And I imagine businesses in those sectors should probably be auditing their existing engagement models and what contracts are being used to manage those fluctuations and whether that needs to be reassessed. So, with that context in mind, Rob, let's move to the mechanics. Once a worker is in scope, how does the guaranteed hours offer process actually work? And what does an employer need to do and by when?
So the process starts with the reference period. The initial reference period for workers already employed will start when the measures come into force, whereas for new starters, it will begin on the first day of employment after the measures commence. The government's preference is for the initial reference period to be 12 weeks long, which it considers draws the right balance between giving workers guaranteed hours reasonably soon and establishing a reliable picture of regularly worked hours. After that initial period, at the end of each reference period, whether initial or subsequent, employers will be required to issue guaranteed hours offers to qualifying workers. This is a recurring, rolling obligation rather than being a one-time exercise. One of the key open questions is what happens with subsequent reference periods. The consultation has put on the table options of 12, 26, or 52 weeks. Rolling 12-week subsequent reference periods could increase the administrative burden for employers, whereas if subsequent reference periods are long, the obligation becomes much less frequent and significantly less burdensome for employers. This is therefore highly consequential and should be watched closely. Whatever option is chosen, businesses should be stress testing their current systems and processes, particularly during peak period, to ensure that they can track working hours and monitor reference periods effectively.
Alison, what does the offer itself actually have to contain, and what constraints does an employer face when making it?
If it wasn't complicated enough, the hours calculation is where the complexity of the measures really starts to ramp up further. So the government is consulting on two options. First, a mean average. So every hour worked in the reference period will equally influence how many hours the employer needs to offer. Or second, a median average, which will discount outlying weeks. So using an example, a worker that does 8 hours for 7 weeks and 20 hours for 5 weeks would receive an offer of 13 hours if you use a mean calculation, but only 8 hours if you use a median. So the median could be more favourable for employers as it allows these outlying high hours weeks to be discounted, which could reduce the number of workers in scope for guaranteed hours offer and reduce the burden for employers. But that is still an open question and the government hasn't stated a preference on which it's going to go for. On the content of the offer needs to be either a variation of the existing contract or a new contract. And the constraint on the new contract route is that it has to propose terms that are overall no less favourable to the worker than those they had during the reference period on everything except hours and contract length. Interesting employers may be given some flexibility to use an adjustment margin, meaning that they might be able to flex their offer up or down by a small margin to align with standard shift patterns or correct calculation errors. That could be a fixed figure, such as 2 hours, or a percentage of the calculated offer, such as 10%. And that sounds minor, but in practice, it could be a genuinely useful operational tool, in particular, helping employers to avoid minor errors that could take them into breach of the regulations.
Thanks, Alison. And I think the more we discuss this topic, it's clear that there really are still a lot of key variables to be decided by the government. What about the information duties, Rob? Is there something employers need to be doing before an offer is even triggered?
Yes, and this is often overlooked. There's actually a proactive information duty where employers must take reasonable steps within a 2 week initial information period to ensure workers are aware of their rights under this new regime. That information must also be kept accessible on an ongoing basis for as long as it's reasonable to think the worker may be in scope. The practical takeaway is straightforward. You cannot wait until the end of the reference period to start thinking about this. You actually need to have systems in place at the point of engagement to identify potentially in scope workers and communicate their rights to them. For many employers, particularly those with large flexible workforces, this may be a significant operational challenge.
That's a really important practical point about early preparation. Now, before we move on to consider agency workers, we should flag, I think, that the right to a guaranteed hours offer does not exist in isolation. It sits alongside other new protections that form part of the same package. Rob, could you just briefly maybe talk us through what other rights employers also need to be mindful of?
Yeah, so the government has also created a new right to reasonable notice of shifts, shift changes or cancellations, and there's a duty to compensate workers for any shift that's moved, curtailed, or cancelled at short notice. The aim is to give workers greater certainty about when they will be working and the number of hours they will get, and therefore greater income stability. These rights largely mirror the guaranteed hours measures that we've just been discussing, but with a few differences. For instance, the low hours threshold may not be the same as for guaranteed hours, and the consultation will consider this point. It also considers what will amount to reasonable notice and short notice, the level of short notice payments, and when it should be payable.
Thanks, Rob. So we've now covered the core guaranteed hours framework, the associated shift notice and cancellation rights as they apply to directly engaged workers. But of course, many employers who rely on flexible labour may also make extensive use of agency workers, and they are dealt with under separate provisions in the Act, which hirers in particular need to be paying very close attention to. Alison, can you walk us through what is different?
Sure. So, following a separate consultation in early 2025, the government decided to extend the provisions on guaranteed hours to agency workers. Crucially, it is the end hirer, not the agency, that has the obligation to make the guaranteed hours offer to a qualifying agency worker. And if an agency worker accepts that offer, they will enter into a direct contract with the end hirer and therefore become directly engaged by that hire. So that is a fundamental shift in the employment relationship. A worker from an agency can become your direct employee or worker by accepting a guaranteed hours offer. The hirer then becomes the employer with all of the legal obligations that flow from that. And I think that's something that many hirers have possibly not yet grasped. The agency worker provisions in the Act run in parallel with the direct worker provisions, and most of the key parameters, such as the threshold, the reference period, and how hours are calculated, operate in largely the same way. What changes is the structure, given the tripartite nature of the relationship, the worker, the agency, and the hirer. The obligation to make the guaranteed hours offer, as I said, sits with the hirer, not the agency, and the regularity test is assessed against what the worker actually did for the specific hirer, not their working pattern across all their engagements if they're working for a number of different hirers.
Thanks, Alison. And Rob, what about the obligations that we just discussed around reasonable notice of shifts, shift changes, and shift cancellation payments? Who is liable for those, and what does the pass through risk look like?
Yeah, so it's the agency who has the obligation to make short notice cancellation payments to agency workers. And the reason for this is that the government wants to ensure that there are no delays in workers receiving pay, and requiring the agency to make the payments is the most efficient route to achieving this. But agencies can recover those payments from hirers in some circumstances, and it's likely that the agency and the end hirer will look to apportion costs and risk under their commercial terms. The practical implication for hirers is clear. If your business is cancelling agency worker shifts at short notice because your demand has changed, the cost of that decision is probably going to find its way back to you. This is a financial risk for businesses that use agency labour heavily, meaning contracts with agencies should probably be reviewed. There is also shared liability for providing reasonable notice of shifts, cancellations, and curtailment. Both the agency and the hirer can be found liable, with apportionment based on which party was responsible. A hirer is only protected if it gave sufficient notice to the agency in time for the agency to pass it on to the worker. That is a procedural point companies will need to embed in their operating models moving forwards.
Thanks, both. This is a significant volume of new compliance obligations. But Alison, let's now be blunt about the consequences of getting this wrong. What does the enforcement picture look like?
Like most other employment statutory rights, workers will be able to bring employment tribunal claims for a wide range of failures under this legislation. So, not making an offer, making a non compliant offer, failing to give required notices of information, and critically, manipulating working hours or contract structures to reduce or avoid the duty from arising. There are real consequences, therefore, for employers who may try to rotate workers through short engagements or reduce hours selectively in the reference period. And in a successful claim, compensation can be awarded for financial loss. It will be up to a maximum, which is to be set in regulations. So important to watch out for that. In addition, there is an automatic unfair dismissal protection with no qualifying period, where dismissal is connected to a worker exercising or being believed to have exercised guaranteed hours rights. So the Act places primary responsibility for enforcement with the employment tribunal system and individuals who bring claims within that system. But the government also intends the Fair Work Agency, which began operating in April 2026, to enforce aspects of these rights, particularly the right to short notice cancellation payments. And that will leverage the existing notice of underpayment regime to help increase compliance and minimise costs for employers and workers by trying to achieve quicker resolution.
So the enforcement risks are real and multi-layered, and that makes early preparation, I think, all the more important. Now, Rob, the current consultation closes on the 25th of August, and we are some way from the regulations landing yet, but that does not mean that employers should do nothing at this stage. What practical tips can we maybe offer to help businesses start preparing?
Thanks, Olivia. So, as you say, even though many of the key rights are still to be ironed out in the consultation, I think there are practical tips for businesses who want to start preparing at this stage. So, firstly, audit your existing flexible workforce, in particular seasonal or temporary staffing models, by tracking periodic variations and reviewing the use of fixed term contracts. Employers need to understand how many workers they have on 0 hours contracts or low hours arrangements, how many hours they're actually working, and whether any of them are approaching what's likely to be a qualifying threshold. That analysis needs to happen before the reference period starts running, rather than afterwards. Employers who routinely re-engage seasonal workers on back-to-back fixed terms should assume that that model is under pressure and take advice on this. Secondly, employers should review agency arrangements. If you're a hirer, your existing commercial agreements with agencies may need updating to include appropriate recovery provisions and allocations of costs in relation to cancellation payments. Thirdly, check your systems and processes. The administrative burden will be significant for managers and those responsible for monitoring working patterns and potentially making guaranteed hours off. You'll need systems in place to track working hours, establish when the obligations arise, and handle shift changes and calculations. Dealing with this now and getting systems and processes in place will help when measures kick in next year. And lastly, consider whether the collective agreement route might be an option. It's possible to contract out of these rights under the terms of a collective agreement, provided it's incorporated into the worker's contract. If you have a recognised trade union, this is potentially a genuine opt-out route, but it requires active steps and agreement to be reached with the union, and therefore some forward planning.
Some really helpful practical steps there. Thanks, Rob. And Alison, a few final thoughts from you. Should employers be engaging with the consultation? And what, if anything, might we see from the recent changes in Westminster?
Absolutely. So the consultation will help to address some of the unanswered questions in the Act, but it also suggests the regime will be incredibly complex. And the honest position is that the dial can still move a very long way on almost every variable that matters in this law. The hours threshold, how long a reference period will run, how the hours figure is calculated, what counts as regular working. And until those decisions land in regulations, it is genuinely hard to model the impact that this is going to have. But that uncertainty is not a reason to wait. The choices that are made in the regulations will directly determine the volume of offers employers have to make, the frequency of the calculation cycle, and how burdensome the administrative machinery is going to be in practice. So employers, especially those in sectors with large flexible workforces, should really consider engaging with the consultation before it closes. In terms of timing, implementation of the measures is still expected in 2027, which is obviously not very far away. While we do now have a new Prime Minister, and there have been some cabinet changes in Westminster in the last couple of weeks, there have not yet been any signals that the government doesn't intend to proceed with this package of reforms. So businesses should proceed on the basis that these measures will happen next year as planned.
Thank you, Alison. And Rob, I'm pretty sure our listeners will have found it useful to hear these practical insights and top tips today. The key takeaway that I have from what we have been discussing is that guaranteed hours should not be added to the 2027 to-do list. The groundwork needs to be laid now, and the consultation process is that genuine opportunity for employers to shape how the final regime actually operates in practice.
Thanks, Olivia. Hopefully, we've cut through some of the complexity, and hopefully, listeners will go away with a slightly clearer picture of what's coming and what to prioritise. But it is undeniably tricky.
Yes, thanks both. Still a lot of detail to be resolved, but the framework is set and the direction of travel remains clear, at least for now.
If you found this episode useful, please subscribe, share it with your network, or visit twobirds.com for further information. Thank you for listening to A New Era, and we hope you join us again next time.